we are all involved in devoting about 40% of our working lives to supporting governmental activities. We all have some of them that we like and some that we dislike, but there are very few of us indeed who believe that we are getting our money's worth for the 40% of our income that is being used to support state, local, and federal governments. And yet, that percentage keeps growing. Why is it that this 40% of government spending doesn't correspond to what the public wants? Why does the public feel they're getting cheated, that they're not getting their money's worth? The answer is because once you start giving somebody else's money away or spending it, somebody will compete to try to get it. And the effect of that will be that there are no benefits from the government spending. Government sets out to spend $1 billion, whatever it is, for a good purpose. That means it's worth somebody's efforts to spend $1 billion to get that $1 billion. You may spend that $1 billion in the form of propagandizing congressmen to get it passed, in the form of election contributions, but you may spend it in much more complicated forms, in lawyers' fees, in preparing projects, in knocking at the door of the government officials who have it to distribute. So the fact is that there's an enormous difference between the benefits people get from government spending and the benefits people get when they spend their own money. And that difference derives from the fact that governments are always spending somebody else's money. The competitive market is a marvelous invention. It works. It works in the economic sphere and it works in the political sphere. And the way in which it works is that market competition tends to lead people to spend nearly as much money to get the subsidies as the subsidies are worth, with the result that everybody feels cheated. The net benefits are much smaller than the gross expenditures. Now the question is, how can you remedy this defect? And I think myself that there is fundamentally only one way in which you can remedy it. And that is by a political change in the form of constitutional provisions which will set a limit to government spending. Every individual in his private life has a budget to spend. If he considers whether to spend more on one thing, he has to ask himself, where's it going to come from? Where am I going to cut? But our legislators don't have that kind of a budget limit. They can vote to spend more. And they will say, where will it come from? Oh, somewhere. The taxpayer will pay for it. What we need is to give our legislators a budget to say this much and no more. Then the special interests can fight with one another instead of the special interests ganging up on you and me and themselves. Because don't kid yourself, we're all special interests. We're all guilty. We're not innocent. There is nobody in this room, I am sure, who has not at one time or another favored what he would recognize as special interest legislation. Of course, it's different when it's our special interest. We all know that what's good for us, well, that's good for the country too. So it's not a question of holier than thou. It's a question of having a setup under which we, in trying to fight for our special interests, have to fight within a limited budget. Well, as you know, I am describing the proposal that got started in the state of California under Proposition 1 4 years ago. I have no hesitancy in discussing that because I am proud to say that I was involved in that campaign and in the design of that amendment and in trying to unsuccessfully to get it passed. The interesting thing to me about that Prop 1 amendment was that at the time we were drawing it up here in the state of California to set a limit on government spending, to say the state government shall spend no more than X% of the personal income of the people. We made it extremely complicated because we tried to cover every possible loophole. We took it for granted that if it were enacted, the legislators would try their best to evade it. I believe now that that was a mistake. The one respect in which I have changed my opinions greatly since then is to discover that if you could once get this through, you could count on the members of legislatures, of state legislatures, and on the federal government of the federal legislature to be your open or secret allies in making it effective. Why? Well, they're decent, public-spirited human beings, no different from you and me. They are now subject to very difficult pressures of those I've described. But they'd be in so much better a position with that amendment. Because now somebody comes to them and says, you've got to vote more money for this good cause or that good cause. And they say, I agree with you, that's a good cause. Where shall I cut? I have a total budget. We can't vote more unless we vote less for something else. What shall we vote less for? So that it would provide the legislator with a protection, enable him to perform his function more effectively. Now, the question at issue is there any reason for hope that we will get this fundamental defect in our political structure reformed? I believe the answer is that there is. There is an enormous groundswell of taxpayer revolt. You are feeling it in this state with the large number of people who signed the petition for the Jarvis-Gann amendment. You are feeling it in every state throughout the country. The taxpayers are simply getting fed up with the burden of government and with the disproportion between what they see as the benefits from government spending and the costs of government spending. And I have been impressed with how rapidly the groundswell for constitutional limitation is growing. In the state of Tennessee, a constitutional convention has recently introduced a spending limitation into a proposal that will go before their citizens this spring. It may well be the first state in the country that will have an explicit limitation on government spending in the Constitution. In the state of Massachusetts, of all states, it's a state which has gotten the nickname of Taxachusetts because it's a state which has one of the highest levels of government spending, of state government spending in the country. But in the state of Massachusetts, a citizens group has gotten through the first stage in a process for a constitutional amendment along these lines. It so happens that their constitution requires a long time before amendment, 3 or 4 years. A similar amendment, this amendment was tried, as you know, a year or two ago in Michigan. It was defeated in Michigan narrowly by exactly the same groups that defeated it in California. Namely, the special interest groups who wanted to see larger government spending, led, I am sorry to say, by the educational associations of the state, the Michigan Educational Association in Michigan and the corresponding California Association here. Don't misunderstand me. Many of the individual teachers are strongly in favor of it. But the bureaucracy, the organization, the administration of education is strongly opposed to it, and for very good reasons. Because they are right, they're pursuing their own interest, because they see that under such a limitation it would be more difficult for them to get ever-increasing expenditures to raise their salaries and their perquisites. So they're not working against their interest, but they have been enormously effective in both Michigan and in California. But I think that we are learning, and that the public sentiment for this is growing, and sooner or later you'll get it passed. After all, we must remember that very few major changes in government have ever been enacted the first time. You have to stick with them. And that's a good thing. because we only want things to be done insofar as the public at large is really persuaded that they are desirable and effective. Many states, in state after state, there is a movement of this kind, but there is also such a movement on the federal level. The Southern Governors Conference about 2 or 3 years ago appointed a task force led by Governor Edwards of South Carolina, and they constructed a constitutional limitation, a constitutional amendment for the federal government that would limit federal government in the same way, federal spending to a certain percentage of the national income. That's at a very early stage. But in my opinion, in the long range, that is the only hope we have for stopping the growth of government, for holding it back.